We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
Hey, everybody, it's Boysen Hodgson. Welcome back to the Mankind Podcast, the podcast where we are setting out to prove that there is more than one way to be a man, and I think we're doing a fine job of it. I get the distinct honor this morning to hang out with Douglas Gillette. Now, you are probably aware, if you've been listening to the podcast and following, that we did a series of 6 podcasts with Douglas back in the earlier part of, 2022, I think that was. Those have proven to be the most popular episodes of the podcast that we ever did. And today I'm bringing Douglas Gillette back to have an expanded conversation, which we're probably going to put into 2 parts, 2 more episodes of the podcast, to talk a little bit more about full integration of the archetypes, femininity, integrating the feminine, and spirituality. So if you're in the mood for those pieces, hang out with us and come through these 2 sections of the podcast. Douglas Gillette, as we know, is an author who has written multiple books. How many books have you published now, Douglas?
I think it's 9. It's 8 or 9. I got another one in the pipeline, but probably won't be published until next year, late in the year, or even 2025. But so be 9 or 10.
He has been a college professor, an author, a lecturer. He's a Jungian. Are you actually an analyst also?
No, I'm not.
You're not.
Yeah, I didn't join that club completely. Actually, I'm not a joiner. So,
there's his bio. Douglas Gillette, not a joiner. Many of us are familiar with Douglas Gillette, especially through the work with Robert Moore on King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and the multiple other books that on the individual archetypes that came out around those archetypes. So we're going to start there. So let's start with King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. Douglas, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, really. I appreciate that too.
You reached back out through a mutual friend of ours, David Carr, and said, hey, I'd like to get back on the podcast. I've got some additional things that I'd like to circle back to. And when we talked before, we talked about integration of the feminine. So let's start at where we are in the world in 2023. What do you see is going on? And why did you reach back out?
I reached back out because I guess that's just who I am in part. Part of me would like to just curl up in a cave somewhere, but there's this extroverted part that still thinks I have something that might help. And that's really the overall purpose of my life as I see it now, from the vantage point of 75, which I turned officially yesterday. Really feels like a milestone. I almost want to carve a little stela of it. I look back and I can see my life in epochs, and I see that really my motivation, pleasure motivations too, and so forth, and family and all that. But to help, to be of service, however it's taken, or however it's received, that's why I reached out. And what was the other part of that? What's going on in the world?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do, after 75 years of having lived through, I would say, joyous, expansive, hopes and dreams, not only mine, but in much of the world, certainly in our society, because I was born in 1948, and the 50s were, I mean, there was, the Cold War and all that, uh, but there was a stability, I think, with the two great powers, the United States and Russia. And so there was this flourishing of optimism and economic growth and well-being in much of the world. Certainly in this country, that is, in my view, long gone. It was built mostly on modernity, I
Yes.
think, the Enlightenment, and pros and cons with the Enlightenment, okay, like with everything else. But the flourishing and growth and sophistication of science and reason, and which gave people hope that maybe we could be a reasonable species.
Yeah.
And not just fall into our chimpanzee background, evolutionary background. Well, that got eroded for a lot of reasons. I think people became gradually disenchanted, and they became actually anti-modernity in some cases.
Right.
And again, pros and cons.
Right.
But the result, I think, is, I think a lot of people are feeling this. Things are just ratcheting down, not just in our society, but again, globally. And I mean, the Russian-Ukraine war, just utterly brutal.
Yes.
Not to mention wars in Africa and so forth, but I mean, on a large scale, massively brutal. And now Israel and the Palestinians. Some of these pots that have been boiling for a long time or simmering have finally exploded as they were going to, and not just with shooting kind of thing back and forth across the border, but barbaric depravity, both on the part of the Palestinians and I'm sorry to say the Israelis too. And it's like I saw an article on the internet the other day, and it ended with, how could we as a species have sunk so low? And the return of medievalism in effect, in terms of rich and poor,
Yeah.
power and not much,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. So Jung said, if you want to know what the real purpose of a course of events is, look at the result. No matter what people think their motivations are, the unconscious is what's steering it and has the last word. And so I would say, as far as the condition of the world is, the human world, the darkness is rising. And sensitive souls feel it, and even those that aren't so sensitive know something's wrong.
Yes. As we got together this morning, we were both kind of reflecting on that. The darkness is rising and sensitive souls feel it. I seem to feel it every day. And what I recognize, I have a lot of young people in my life because I have teenage kids. And I see it there clearly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they feel it. I have a 27-year-old daughter who, is a few years ahead of the kids that you are in relationship with. And I can say, it's never true that everybody feels that way, one way or another.
Right.
But masses of her generation feel that way. They just feel threat and a kind of growing despair and hopelessness. And, economically, socially, racially, you name it, religiously, and they are just kind, as you said, and as we were talking a few minutes ago before the podcast, there's a sense of paralysis.
Yes.
I think we're in collective shock, really,
Yes.
that after all of the struggles of uh, human beings, I mean, I'll say Western Europe and what became the United States and so forth, and all the blood, literally, sweat, tears, and lives given over to creating a more humane world, fairer economically and every other way, racially, religiously, and just see that falling apart and a return to medievalism. It's horrible.
I do not intend to have this podcast stay in this vein for this whole this whole amount of time that
No,
we are
that's
together.
fine.
So
Yeah.
that, in some language, we're framing the problem that we are setting out to look at here in this. And I also want to kind of get your reflection back because I look at, okay, so let's go to 1939, 1941, 1945. Let's look at Russia. Let's look at what happened in Germany. Let's look at what happened in, let's look at the Chinese Revolution. Let's look back, and if we keep going back through history, the cycle of darkness rising is not something new, right?
No, it's not. I mean, I believe that through my life experience and the study of history, that we never are able to reduce darkness. We reconfigure it, through historical processes, through revolutions, through this and that. We're not able to reduce it. And I think the reason we're not, I mean, en masse, individuals, I think, can, as individuals, but 8 billion of us cannot. And the reason I think is, and pardon me if there are creationists listening, I'm not anti-creationist in a certain sense, but I think there's incontrovertible evidence that we are 99 point, and the decimals keep going. Yes. It's up to 99.9% the genetic makeup of chimpanzees. And if you map human behavior en masse on chimpanzee behavior down to the minutia of strategies for gaining power and sex and, in that sense, wealth, it's a perfect match. So I'm afraid we're stuck with ourselves.
I'm afraid we're stuck with ourselves. And yet we have this extra something in us. Mark, I'm listening to The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson, which is a lovely book that I highly recommend. Mark Manson talks about the idea of human beings as being consciousness boiled down to, we are capable of imagining the world without us in it.
Yeah. We're also capable of imagining ourselves as other than what we are, which is, okay, so now we get into depth psychology and spirituality, because, we don't become ever wholly other than we are. But I know from my own analysis many years ago that there is, or appears to be, feels like there is such a thing in however small doses as freedom of choice, the capacity to choose something else. But that only comes, I think, in a genuine form when our analysis or whatever process we're in has allowed us to see, to really see our makeup. and neutralize the complexes and and exorcise, I guess, the archetypes if they're dominating our lives.
That's a beautiful segue into the archetypes and looking at ourselves. So for many of us in the Mankind Project, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover has been kind of a tome that we refer back to and look at in terms of how am I integrating these archetypes.
Yeah.
So give us just a very brief on archetypes as as metaphorical frameworks. Start there. Archetypes as metaphorical frameworks.
Yeah, the idea of archetypes goes back at least as far as Plato, but actually even earlier. The ancient Egyptians are using them and are to some extent conscious of their presence and that they can be integrated and manipulated and appealed to and brought into a harmonious relationship. So this idea is not new.
Right.
But the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover archetypes, Robert and I convinced that these are, it's certainly not all the archetypes.
Right.
You can go on and on with archetypes, but core framing, as you say, archetypes for the male psyche, but also the female, for the masculine and also the feminine. Tony Wolfe, one of Jung's purported mistresses and so forth, very, very smart. She saw early on 4 archetypes in the feminine consciousness that roughly correspond to what Robert and I came up with in the male, or the masculine, I should say. And we should say,
yeah, right,
that
that
masculine, feminine are not quite the same thing as male, female by any means. Actually, there's quite a difference. And men and women are even, those terms are even further removed from masculine and feminine. So if I slip on that, just be aware that I'm aware that there are 3 levels at which to talk about this.
Beautiful. So there's the default, like connection does not equal correlation, does not equal causation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So Robert's in my, I will never forget the day that we were sitting in a cafe in Hyde Park in Chicago. And, Robert had gotten a lot of work done on defining King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And he had a sense of the shadows, especially of the king and the warrior. But I'll never forget the day I studied all of his stuff. I was a student of his, actually, originally.
Uh-huh.
I went to Chicago Theological Seminary because he was there and trying to find ways to integrate or to, integrate and make explicit connections between the archetypal realm, not limited to the masculine archetypes, the archetypal realm and Christianity, because I was studying to be a pastor. But anyway, several years later, he came to me and he said, "Doug, let's write a book." I said, "Okay." So I went through all of his materials, and we were sitting in this cafe, and I said, I called him Bob. Bob, I think these archetypes are bipolar in the sense of there's an overly exuberant or overly expressive side to the shadow, I mean, and an underwhelming or side.
Right.
To each and that's what the shadow is made up of for each of them. And we proceeded with that and came to the conclusion that one of the biggest, it's only one, but one of the biggest issues with at least men is they haven't seen that in themselves, the bipolarity of
Oh, yeah.
of their shadows. They haven't even
Yeah.
seen the shadow, but much less the bipolarity. So they
Right.
don't have a good map for how to access, we'll say, or interface with the archetypes in their in what we call their fullness. So there's that. There's
Yes.
integrating the shadows and bringing them up into the ideal for each archetype. Then there's integrating the archetypes. You know, uh, the warrior cannot, for example, be in his in a healthful fullness, let's say, uh, without the magician uh, in his
Anthropomorphizing the
anthropomorphizing here,
archetypes. Yes.
et cetera, because each is intertwined with the other. Um, even in their fullness, they must be integrated as archetypes. Um, or you get one-sided people or two-sided people, but not full masculinity, let's say. Um, and then beyond that, kind of with it, but beyond it, I think is what about the feminine in a
Yes. Yes.
man? Well, as I look at myself and as I look at creative men throughout history that we know about, and I'm sure there are many more that we don't, they have a good relationship with their what Jung called the anima, the inner feminine, who also is multifaceted.
Yes.
And will show up here, will show up there, whatever. But so, in terms of creative work for a man, the feminine, the anima, must be integrated. That goes for relationships too.
So now let's define. I like the fact that you actually just switched over into the anima animus kind of thing, which may depoliticize a little bit feminine masculine, right?
Yeah.
So what does the anima look like?
She shows up in all kinds of guises in my life. She does exhibit traits of the mother and the pros and cons and vices and virtues of that, of mothers, actual mothers, but archetypal mother too. She shows up as lover. And let me do a little sidebar here. My view of one thing that's happened, one of the downsides of, I'll say, radical feminism, not feminism per se, which I'm very much for, but the man hating kind, is, I know this from my daughter's life. When I was in junior high and high school, we went to dances, right, on Friday nights at the school. The dances were primarily boys with girls, girls with boys. They aren't anymore.
Yeah.
Boys dance over here by them, kind of by themselves with each other, girls over here. And that's just a way of saying that when you take romance out of the men women equation, what you have left, I'm quoting my daughter here in her dating experience, is a meat market.
Yeah.
And if you're wondering why it's a meat market, it's because the romance has been expunged. Not really, it's in there, but I mean, it's been repressed. So there's also so there's the nurturing mother, there's the witch mother, there's the romantic interest, personal, person to person. She shows up, as meat, feminine meat, in much of the dating world, pornography, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow.
She's also the wise old woman, unattached, perhaps. The healer, that lives just outside the village. Um, and she is the Amazon. She's the killer too.
Yeah.
And so she's very rich, but in a general sense, and I agree with Harville Hendrix here. I don't agree that marriage is for the purpose of getting the love you didn't get from your father or your mother, and you work it out together. I don't think it's for therapy, but I do agree that the wounds and deficits from both father and mother that we experience in childhood, if we do through repetition compulsion repeat that in our relationships,
Yes.
until we can for men integrate the masculine archetypes, the mature archetypes of masculinity, yes, but then also the feminine. Very little talked about, in my view. I know there's a lot of work with the father issues in MKP and other yes, venues, and it's obvious that many fathers were inadequate. Mine was in the Philippines.
Or absent, right? I was going to say, or absent.
Absent.
Yes.
Yeah. And however, there are also mother issues, unseen, unknown, unresolved for many, many of us.
Yes.
Again, well known in psychological circles, one must psychologically, certainly not physically, psychologically kill the power both of the father but also of the mother. A man must, over his psyche, over himself. The mother must be seen as not me. In order to be solid in one's masculine identity, I'll just give you my experience.
Okay.
My mother, I loved her very, very much, really and truly and deeply. And we had, and still have, even though she's been dead for 20 years, a powerful relationship. Eric Newman, Art and the Creative Unconscious,
yes,
etc. And at the same time, she was lovelorn and grieved her whole life for her first romance, which went south, in which she was rejected. And so, I mean, she married my father, but that didn't work out. But I mean, the point is, she had this wound, which she tried to fill, A, with me, and B, at the same time, I was enough like my father that she specifically, not consciously, tried to castrate me, basically. Tried to take or repress or suppress my maleness. So, but I was a fighter, and I fought and fought and fought her, and was able to affirm much of my masculinity, even growing up under her roof. But I got into Jungian analysis partly because I needed to find a way. I was having no luck in relationships. I mean, it was awful. They kept turning out to be my mother, and if I would choose something else, it was uninteresting. So I finally realized I'm in the grip of a mother complex. So that's what I started my analysis with. Well, anyway, we were quite a ways through the analytical process, and here comes the men's movement in various incarnations, which I got involved in really because of Robert, and that added a piece of. And another weird thing is, about the same time, I was studying primate ethology, the chimpanzees I alluded to before. So I could, sometimes you have to step out of your, well, always, you have to step out of your identity in order to see. The chimpanzees are removed enough from humans that I could then see in them human feelings, behaviors, etc.
Yeah.
So that, and I finally, there was a culminating argument between my mother and me. Went and drove from Chicago to Rock Island to her house, and within 10 minutes we were fighting again. And she said something, and my response was, God All Mother Mighty, instead of God Almighty Mother. God equals Almighty Mother. There was stunned silence. We both realized what I had just said. And that broke the complex. That was it. A few minutes later, I understood that she was my sister. That we're all siblings, we're brothers and sisters, regardless of the generational hierarchy. We're all brothers and sisters, which means, to me, we're all children of whatever you want to call it. In
Something
this
bigger.
case, God All Mother Mighty.
Something bigger. Thank you for that story. Now we have to go back. I was an English literature major. Now we have to go unpack it.
Yeah.
So there's this aspect that I see in what you're in the story about your mom, right? That the outcome, what we're going for, is two things at the same time, which is humanizing, right? Which is demystifying.
Right.
Yes, on the one hand, and then at the same time, recognizing and making more mysterious the bigger connections, right? Because once you were able to get out of the complex, once you're able to step backwards from that, then it's like, oh my goodness, this realm of archetypes, this realm of histories, this realm of interconnections, this realm of wounding that goes from generation to generation, from individual to individual, group to group, all of these things. It's unfathomable, it's mysterious, it's bigger than all of us. And once we step outside of it, it's like, oh, here we are, just humans.
Yeah.
And able to claim our own sense of identities and power.
Yeah, I was gonna, yes. And I was gonna say that healthy male and female, or men and women relationships depend upon both men and women breaking the power of the mother, the father too, but the mother. And then I want to get to your larger, but practically speaking, I have to be solid, centered, defended, strong, confident in my male identity before I can have a healthful, happy, joyful, productive, whatever I want to say, relationship with a woman.
Or probably anyone
in a sense, but where it really hits home,
that primary relationship,
heterosexual anyway, is that relationship, the male-female relationship. Same goes for women. they have to be confident of themselves and know who they are, their identities and so forth too, before they have to break the power of the mother over them as well as the father too, in order to have an optimal relationship with a male. But the trajectories are a little bit different. A girl is obviously from the same gender until there are more complexities that show up,
Right.
then we have a multi-gender thing. But
Speaking on the averages here, we're
speaking
playing on the averages.
On the
Yes.
bell curve,
Yes.
girls are born the same for the most part. Gender identity is their mothers. We were all once our mothers in a certain sense before we were born. The task of becoming a woman involves, not limited to, but involves, in my view, the young woman getting free of the dominating power of her mother. But she does that without having to change her gender. It's just one person getting free, breaking the emotional hold of the other.
Right.
Boys have a much harder time because they have to do that, and at the same time, incarnate or create is too strong a word, but become, again, bell curves, the opposite gender from the mother. They have to become a different individual from the mother, but they also have to become the opposite gender. So they have a twofold task, which, if there's an absent or wounded father in the picture, is a lot harder to become a boy. Arrow that way toward a man.
And to then begin to, and I think that most of us, this is true for me, certainly as a teenager, that differentiation also involved reconciling the good and bad, the golden shadow that I was already seeing.
Yeah.
And I think for boys, it's even more true today, and probably for younger boys, the golden shadow, the danger and the goodness that we see in men out there in the world. So there's not only that differentiation on an individual level, but it's also the reconciliation. Collective. I have to understand, and it's very difficult. It's hard.
It is hard. Yeah, it really is hard. But the old adage in virtually every school of psychology is you have to become consolidated and confident in your identity. We're talking about gender right now, but in every other way too. And only then are you free of the power of the other, whatever shape that takes. We've been talking about mother, father, masculine, feminine, etc. Well, not really that. Male, female. Masculine, feminine is a little bit different thing. But we all have to become consolidated. Not impervious, but have solid enough cores and good enough fencing, borders to then go back and reconcile with, from a position of strength, hopefully, another who also has a position of strength, psychological strength. Because if they don't, you can't reconcile with them either, no matter how much you try.
We are all dependent upon one another to do that individual work.
We are.
Or, boundaries. This goes into a conversation about boundaries, right? Or I have to be willing to create boundaries so that I can maintain my individual power and autonomy in the face of others who are unwilling or unable to do that work.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, to be in any way and adequately, and adequately is too weak a word, a human being in as close to fullness as we can get, or wholeness as we can get.
Yeah.
It is difficult, which is why there are so few analysans in the world. I mean, there are other things that are immediately more important, like being able to survive,
Right.
and so forth. But for those who have some degree of leisure, I guess, to attend to these things, it's difficult. And you see how difficult it is the further into it you get. But it's also, that difficulty is worth it if you have in my view, certainly has been for me, if you can get through it and become initiated into a more whole equals humane, strong, but humane and loving person.
That was very well said. We are going to shift the conversation somewhat now into spirituality. So this may be where we take a little break. Join us for part 2 when we come back of a conversation about integrating the archetypes, individuation, and now we're going to wander into the realm of spirituality.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. And I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us. It happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.